The winter of 1944 arrived in Europe like a harbinger of doom. By December, the killing cold had settled over the Ardennes forest with the merciless intensity of a medieval siege. Snow blanketed the ancient trees in deceptive beauty while beneath, the ground froze solid as iron. American soldiers huddled in their foxholes, sharing whatever warmth they could find, their breath forming ghostly clouds in the bitter air. Most had no idea they were about to witness one of the most audacious military operations in human history. Adolf Hitler, desperate and cornered in his underground bunker, was preparing to unleash his final gamble. The Führer had been planning this moment for months, watching as Allied forces ground inexorably toward the German homeland. His generals told him the war was lost. His cities burned under Allied bombers. His armies bled out on two fronts. But Hitler possessed one last card to play, and he was determined to play it with devastating effect. The plan was breathtakingly ambitious in its scope and terrifying in its implications. Hitler would mass his final reserves, nearly 300,000 men and over 1,000 tanks in absolute secrecy, then hurl them through the thinly defended Ardennes sector. The objective was nothing less than the recapture of Antwerp, the vital Belgian port that supplied the entire Allied war effort. If successful, the attack would split British and American forces, potentially forcing a separate peace and buying Hitler precious time to deploy his promised miracle weapons. On the morning of December 16, 1944, the German army unleashed Operation Watch on the Rhine with the fury of a wounded beast. The thunderous roar of artillery shattered the pre-dawn silence as thousands of shells screamed across the frozen landscape. American positions, held by inexperienced troops and battle-weary veterans resting from previous campaigns, simply disintegrated under the massive bombardment. What followed was a nightmare of confusion and terror. German paratroopers descended from the dark sky, while tanks emerged from the forest mist, like mechanical demons. American units, caught completely off guard by the scale and ferocity of the assault, found themselves surrounded and cut off. Radio communications collapsed. Supply lines severed. Entire divisions began to crumble as German spearheads punched deep into Allied lines. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. For months, Allied intelligence had assured everyone that the German army was a broken force, incapable of mounting significant offensive operations. The reality of 300,000 enemy soldiers, advancing at breakneck speed, shattered that comforting illusion in a matter of hours. Panic began to spread through the Allied command structure as the full scope of the disaster became clear. At the tip of the German spear, SS Oberfuhrer Otto Skorzeny led a special unit of English-speaking commandos dressed in captured American uniforms and driving stolen jeeps. Their mission was to sow confusion behind enemy lines by misdirecting traffic, cutting communication cables, and spreading false information. The psychological warfare was devastatingly effective. American soldiers began to doubt every uniform they saw, every order they received. The fog of war had become a choking cloud of terror and uncertainty. Within 48 hours, German forces had advanced nearly 60 miles, creating a massive bulge in the Allied lines that threatened to rupture the entire Western Front. The Belgian towns of St. Vith and Bastogne, crucial road junctions that controlled the few decent routes through the Ardennes, found themselves surrounded by enemy forces. American troops, trapped and outnumbered, prepared for what might be their final battle. In the chaos of retreat and confusion, one name began to circulate through Allied command posts with increasing urgency: George S. Patton, the controversial general, known to his men as Old Blood and Guts, was commanding the Third Army, some 125 miles south of the breakthrough. If anyone could mount a counterattack fast enough to save the situation, it was Patton. But could he move an entire army across that distance in the middle of winter, against enemy resistance, in time to matter? General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, was facing the greatest crisis of his military career. At his headquarters in Versailles, intelligence reports painted an increasingly grim picture. German forces were advancing on multiple axes, threatening to reach the Meuse River and potentially drive all the way to Paris. The carefully planned Allied advance into Germany had been not just halted, but thrown into reverse with shocking violence. On December 19th, 3 days after the German offensive began, Eisenhower convened an emergency meeting in the ancient fortress town of Verdun. The location was symbolically appropriated. It was here that the French army had made its heroic stand against German assault in World War I. Now, Allied commanders gathered in a cold stone barracks, warmed only by a single potbelly stove, to decide whether they could avoid a catastrophic defeat. The atmosphere in the room was tense beyond description. Maps covered with red arrows showing German advances dominated the walls. Bradley, Patton, and other senior commanders studied the situation with growing alarm. Some estimated that German forces might reach the English Channel within days, recreating the disaster of 1940, when Nazi armies had driven Allied forces into the sea at Dunkirk. Eisenhower, trying to maintain morale despite the dire circumstances, insisted that the crisis should be viewed as an opportunity rather than a disaster. "I want only cheerful faces around this table," he declared, though few could manage even a forced smile. The German offensive had exposed the Third Reich's desperation. He argued, if they could blunt this attack and then counterattack, they might destroy Hitler's last reserves and end the war months ahead of schedule. But first, they had to survive the next few days. German forces were still advancing, still threatening to break through to the Meuse. The town of Bastogne, held by the 101st Airborne Division, was completely surrounded and running out of ammunition, medical supplies, and food. If Bastogne fell, the Germans would control the road networks. They needed to sustain their advance toward Antwerp. When Eisenhower outlined his plan for a counterattack, all eyes turned to Patton. The Supreme Commander needed someone to disengage at least 6 divisions from current positions, wheel them north through the worst weather in decades, and attack the southern flank of the German advance within days. The logistical challenges were staggering. Moving hundreds of thousands of men with their tanks, artillery, and supplies over icy roads in blizzard conditions seemed impossible. George, Eisenhower asked directly, "When can you start?" Patton's response became legendary. "As soon as you're through with me, I can attack the day after tomorrow morning." The room fell silent. Other commanders looked at Patton with expressions ranging from skepticism to disbelief. The notion of moving an entire army that quickly, under those conditions, seemed like dangerous bragging from a general known for his outlandish statements. Even Eisenhower was incredulous. "Don't be fatuous, George," the Supreme Commander warned. "If you try to go that early, you won't have all 3 divisions ready. And you'll go piecemeal." But Patton wasn't bragging. Unknown to the others in the room, he had anticipated this moment with characteristic foresight. While his fellow generals had been caught off guard by the German offensive, Patton's intelligence staff had been warning for days that a major enemy attack was imminent. He had already prepared 3 separate contingency plans for exactly this situation and left them with his deputy back at 3rd Army headquarters. All Patton needed to do was make a single phone call with the code phrase, "play ball," and 250,000 men would begin one of the most remarkable military movements in history. The man who had raced across France in the summer of 1944, who had captured Metz after 1,000 years of impregnability, who had crossed the Saar River against fierce German resistance, was about to attempt something even more audacious. Turning to Bradley, Patton delivered one of the most confident statements in military history. The crowd stuck his head in a meat grinder, and this time I've got hold of the handle." He was taking the war directly to the enemy, and he intended to make them pay a terrible price for their gamble. The meeting ended with Patton authorized to attack. On December 22nd, just 48 hours away, as he prepared to leave the room, Eisenhower walked with him to the door. "Funny thing, George," the Supreme Commander joked, referring to his recent promotion to 5-star rank. "Every time I get another star, I get attacked." Patton's response was immediate and characteristically sharp. "And every time you get attacked, Ike, I have to bail you out." What followed was a military movement of such scale and complexity that it defied belief. Patton's Third Army, spread across a front of over 100 miles, had to disengage from active combat, turn 90 degrees north, and advance through some of the worst weather in European history. More than 133,000 vehicles moved an average distance of 11 miles each, carrying 62,000 tons of supplies. Communication teams laid nearly 20,000 miles of new telephone wire to coordinate the massive operation. The weather was Patton's greatest enemy. Temperatures dropped far below freezing, turning roads into skating rinks and limiting visibility to mere yards. Snow fell steadily, accumulating to depths that made movement treacherous for both vehicles and men. Many soldiers later said that cold was more terrifying than enemy fire at least bullets killed you quickly. But Patton drove his men forward with relentless determination. He appeared at command posts and along convoy routes at all hours, his face red from the cold, his famous ivory-handled pistols visible at his waist. When vehicles slid off icy roads into ditches, Patton would dismount from his jeep and help push them back onto the road. When soldiers complained about the impossible conditions, he would remind them that they were saving their surrounded comrades in Bastogne. The transformation of Patton's army was nothing short of miraculous. Units that had been facing east toward the Saar suddenly found themselves marching north toward Belgium. Supply lines that had taken months to establish were abandoned and rebuilt in a matter of days. Artillery batteries that had been registered on German positions miles away suddenly had to find new targets in completely different terrain. Meanwhile, in the surrounded town of Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division was fighting for its life. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding the American defense, knew that Patton's forces were coming but had serious doubts about whether they could arrive in time. The paratroopers were running out of everything: ammunition, medical, supplies, food, and hope. German forces surrounding Bastogne launched attack after attack, trying to overrun the American positions before relief could arrive. Panzer tanks rolled through the streets, while German infantry cleared buildings room by room. The American perimeter shrank daily as casualties mounted and defensive positions became untenable. On December 22, German commanders sent an ultimatum demanding the immediate surrender of Bastogne. The message, delivered under a flag of truce, warned that continued resistance would result in the total destruction of the American force. McAuliffe's response became one of the most famous in military history: nuts. It was transmitted back to the German lines, leaving enemy commanders bewildered by the apparent meaninglessness of the American reply. But McAuliffe's defiance couldn't change the mathematical reality of the situation. His men were outnumbered at least 3-1, surrounded, and running out of supplies. Without immediate relief, Bastogne would fall within days. Giving the Germans control of the road network, they needed to continue their advance toward Antwerp. Patton was acutely aware of the time pressure. Every hour of delay meant more American casualties in Bastogne, and more German reinforcements reaching the battlefield. He drove his advancing columns mercilessly, appearing at bottlenecks to personally direct traffic, cursing at delays, and pushing exhausted men beyond what they thought were their limits. The weather remained Patton's greatest obstacle. The thick cloud cover prevented Allied aircraft from providing support or even reconnaissance. German forces could move in relative safety, while American units advanced blind through the snow. Patton, despite his reputation for aggressive atheism, decided that divine intervention was required. Summoning his chief chaplain, Colonel James O'Neill, Patton made an extraordinary request. "I want a prayer for weather," he declared. "I'm tired of these soldiers having to fight mud and flood as well as Germans. See if we can't get God to work on our side." The chaplain, initially taken aback by the unusual request, protested that it wasn't customary for men of his profession to pray for clear weather to kill fellow human beings. Patton's response was immediate and characteristically direct. "Are you teaching me theology, or are you the chaplain of the Third Army? I want a prayer." The resulting prayer, printed on wallet-sized cards and distributed to every soldier in the Third Army, began, "Almighty and merciful Father, we humbly beseech thee, of thy great goodness, to restrain these immoderate rains with which we have had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle, whether through divine intervention or meteorological coincidence." The weather began to clear, just as Patton's forces reached the outskirts of Bastogne. On December 23, for the first time in a week, Allied aircraft could fly. Fighter bombers immediately began hammering German positions while transport planes dropped supplies to the defenders of Bastogne. The psychological impact on both sides was enormous. American troops, who had felt abandoned and outnumbered, suddenly realized that help was coming. German forces, who had been advancing with confidence, found themselves under constant air attack. Patton's lead elements, spearheaded by the 4th Armored Division, began their final push toward Bastogne. On December 22, the fighting was savage beyond description. German forces, knowing that their entire offensive depended on holding their gains, fought with desperate determination. They had constructed elaborate defensive positions, mined the roads, and positioned anti-tank guns at every choke point. 4th Armored Division, commanded by Major General Hugh Gaffey, had been fighting across Europe for months. They were experienced, battle-hardened, and utterly ruthless in combat, but the advance toward Bastogne tested them beyond anything they had previously experienced. In a single day, one battalion lost 33 tanks to German anti-tank fire. The roads were littered with burning American vehicles and the bodies of men who had died fighting in sub-zero temperatures. Patton, monitoring the battle from his headquarters in Luxembourg City, grew increasingly frustrated with the pace of advance. He radioed his corps commander, Major General John Milliken, with characteristic impatience. "There's too much piddling around. Tanks can operate on this ground now." When Milliken reported heavy German resistance and continued tank losses, Patton ordered him to bypass strongpoints and drive straight for Bastogne. The final push began on Christmas Day, 1944. Patton, despite the desperate nature of the battle, was determined that every soldier in the Third Army would receive a hot turkey dinner to mark the holiday. He spent much of the day visiting forward positions, checking on his men, and ensuring that his orders were carried out even under combat conditions. The scene was surreal beyond imagination. American soldiers ate turkey sandwiches in foxholes, while German artillery shells exploded around them. Tank crews shared Christmas rations while their vehicles advanced through snow stained red with blood. Medics treated frostbite and bullet wounds simultaneously, while carols played on portable radios when the static cleared. By late afternoon on December 26, advance elements of the 4th Armored Division had reached the outskirts of Bastogne. Lieutenant Charles Bogus, commanding the lead tank, made contact with American defenders just as darkness fell. The siege of Bastogne was broken, though fighting would continue for weeks. The relief of Bastogne was headline news around the world, but it was only the beginning of Patton's counter-offensive. The general was determined not just to save the surrounded garrison, but to destroy the entire German offensive. His forces continued attacking north and east, grinding through German defensive positions with methodical brutality. The fighting took on an almost medieval quality. Villages changed hands multiple times as German and American forces launched attack and counterattack. The snow, initially pristine white, became stained with blood from thousands of casualties on both sides. Tank battles raged across frozen fields while infantry fought hand-to-hand in bombed-out buildings. German resistance was fierce, but increasingly desperate. Many of their units were composed of hastily trained teenagers and old men, equipped with obsolete weapons and supported by dwindling supplies. But they fought with the fanatical determination of men defending their homeland against invaders they knew would show no mercy. The weather continued to play a crucial role in the battle. When skies cleared, Allied aircraft dominated the battlefield, destroying German vehicles and supply columns with impunity. When clouds returned, German forces could move and attack without fear of airstrikes. The battle became a race between American ground forces and German reinforcements. With weather as the deciding factor, Patton's advance gradually compressed the German salient, forcing enemy units into an ever smaller area, where they became increasingly vulnerable to artillery fire. The bulge that had initially threatened to split Allied forces in half slowly disappeared as American units attacked from south and north. Simultaneously, the human cost was staggering on both sides. American casualties in the Battle of the Bulge exceeded 80,000 men, including more than 10,000 killed. German losses were even higher, with entire divisions effectively destroyed in the fighting. The frozen ground made burial impossible, so bodies were stacked like cordwood until spring thaws allowed proper interment. By mid-January 1945, German resistance was crumbling across the entire front. Hitler's gamble had failed catastrophically, costing him his last strategic reserves and hastening the end of the war. The Führer's promised miracle weapons never materialized, and his armies found themselves fighting a losing battle on multiple fronts with dwindling resources. The Battle of the Bulge became Patton's finest hour, cementing his reputation as one of history's greatest military commanders. His ability to move an entire army across difficult terrain in terrible weather conditions, then successfully attack a prepared enemy, demonstrated military leadership of the highest order. Even his critics acknowledged that without Patton's intervention, the German offensive might have succeeded in splitting Allied forces and prolonging the war. But the victory came at a terrible price. The snow-covered battlefields of the Ardennes were littered with the wreckage of war-burned-out tanks, demolished buildings, and thousands of graves marked only by crude wooden crosses. The snow painted red was not just a metaphor, but a horrific reality witnessed by everyone who fought in the battle. The German army, which had launched Operation Watch on the Rhine with such confidence just weeks earlier, was now in full retreat toward the Rhine River. Hitler's last great gamble had failed, and with it, any hope of avoiding total defeat. The Third Reich, which the Führer had promised would last 1,000 years, had perhaps months remaining. For Patton personally, the Battle of the Bulge represented both triumph and tragedy. He had achieved one of the greatest military feats in American history, but the cost in human lives weighed heavily on his conscience. The general, who was known for his aggressive tactics and colorful language, was privately devastated by the casualties his army had suffered. In letters to his wife Beatrice, Patton revealed the emotional toll of command. Despite his public bravado, he was haunted by the faces of dead soldiers and the knowledge that his decisions had sent thousands of young men to their deaths. The burden of leadership in combat was something that never left him, even in his moments of greatest triumph. The strategic implications of the battle extended far beyond the immediate military situation. Hitler's defeat in the Ardennes convinced many German generals that continued resistance was futile. The resources expended in the offensive, men, tanks, fuel, ammunition, could never be replaced. The Third Reich was rapidly approaching complete collapse. From a tactical perspective, the Battle of the Bulge demonstrated the evolution of modern warfare. The combination of air power, mechanized forces, and rapid communication had created a new kind of battlefield, where traditional defensive positions could be bypassed or destroyed from the air. Patton's use of combined arms tactics, coordinating infantry, armor, artillery, and air support became a model for future military operations. The battle also highlighted the importance of leadership in extreme circumstances. While other Allied commanders struggled to respond to the German offensive, Patton's quick thinking and aggressive action turned potential disaster into decisive victory. His willingness to take risks, combined with meticulous planning and relentless execution, made the difference between success and failure. The legend of Patton's achievements in the Battle of the Bulge grew over time, sometimes obscuring the contributions of the thousands of soldiers who actually fought the battles. The general himself was always careful to credit his men for their sacrifices, but popular history often focused on his dramatic personality rather than their quiet heroism. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, Patton continued his advance into Germany, crossing the Rhine River and driving toward the heart of the Third Reich. But he would never forget the lessons learned in the snowy forests of the Ardennes, where American determination had triumphed over German desperation in one of the most crucial battles of World War II. The town of Bastogne, which had become synonymous with American resistance during the siege, gradually returned to normal life as the front moved eastward. But the memory of those desperate December days, when the outcome of the war hung in the balance, would never be forgotten by those who lived through them. Today, the battlefields of the Battle of the Bulge are peaceful forests and farmlands, marked only by monuments and military cemeteries. But beneath the soil lie the remnants of one of history's most decisive battles, the place where German confidence in victory died, and American determination to win was forged in blood and snow. The phrase "painting the snow red" became a grim metaphor for the cost of victory, but it also symbolized the price that free nations were willing to pay to defeat tyranny. In those frozen forests of the Ardennes, American soldiers proved that democracy could produce warriors as fierce and determined as any in the world. Patton himself would not survive to see the full implications of his victory. He died in a car accident in Germany just months after the war ended, never returning to the United States he had served so brilliantly. He was buried in Luxembourg, among the graves of soldiers who had died fighting under his command, a fitting final resting place for the general, who had led them through their darkest hour to ultimate victory. The Battle of the Bulge remains a testament to the power of leadership under pressure, the importance of preparation and flexibility, and the courage of ordinary soldiers faced with extraordinary circumstances. When the Germans thought they were unstoppable, Patton and his Third Army proved them catastrophically wrong, painting the snow red with the blood of enemies who had underestimated American resolve and military capability.